Where did the people disappear? The terrible mystery of 19th-century empty cities. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Ashford like a shroud. But it wasn't the mist that made Professor Edmund Blackwood's hands tremble as he stepped from his carriage. It was the silence. A silence so complete, so unnatural, that it seemed to press against his eardrums with an almost physical weight. Ashford had been a thriving industrial town just 3 months ago. Population, 12,847 souls. Cotton mills, workers' quarters, bustling marketplaces, and the constant din of progress that characterized England's rapidly expanding industrial landscape. Now, as Blackwood walked down what had once been the main thoroughfare, his footsteps echoed like gunshots in a cathedral. The Royal Geographic Society had commissioned him to investigate what newspapers were calling the Great Vanishing, a phenomenon that had struck 17 towns across Britain, France, and Germany between 1847 and 1851. Towns where entire populations had simply disappeared. Not fled, not died, not relocated. Disappeared, as if they had never existed at all, save for the empty buildings that stood as monuments to their absence. Blackwood pulled his journal from his coat pocket, the leather binding damp from the morning air. His first entry from Ashford read, "No signs of struggle. No Boethius. No indication of mass exodus. Personal belongings remain untouched. Wells still functional. Food stores intact but beginning to spoil. Most disturbing, no animals. Not even rats." He had spent the previous 6 weeks investigating similar sites across the continent. Each told the same impossible story. Roanoke Colony had vanished in America centuries earlier, leaving behind only the cryptic word Croton carved into a post. But these 19th century disappearances were different. They left behind no clues at all, only emptiness. The pattern had first emerged in the small French village of Saint-Mere-Vert in the autumn of 1847. The mail coach had arrived to find streets devoid of life, doors standing open, bread still warm in ovens. The local constabulary from the neighboring town of Rouen had conducted a thorough investigation, led by Inspector Henri Duval, a man whose methodical approach to criminal investigation had earned him recognition throughout Normandy. Duval's reports, which Blackwood had studied extensively in the archives of the Prefecture of Police, painted a picture of systematic bafflement. The population of 2,156 residents appears to have vanished between the hours of 6 p.m. on October 15th and dawn on October 16th, Duval had written. The last confirmed sighting was of Père Moreau ringing the evening church bells. The bells were found still swaying the following morning, though no wind was present. What had struck Duval most forcefully was the absence of any logical explanation. No signs of plague. The regional medical officer, Dr. Auguste Lemaire, had examined the town exhaustively. No evidence of military action. No damage to buildings. No spent ammunition. No disturbed earth that might suggest mass graves. No indication of voluntary departure. Personal effects, including valuable jewelry and family heirlooms, remained untouched in their proper places. It is as if, Duval had concluded in his final report, the very essence of human presence simply evaporated, leaving behind only the material shell of a community. The phenomenon had spread with irregular but relentless persistence. 6 months after Saint-Mere-Vert, the German town of Waldenburg suffered the same fate. A prosperous mining community nestled in the Bavarian Alps, Waldenburg had been known throughout the region for its silver mines and the exceptional craftsmanship of its metalworkers. When the weekly supply wagon failed to return from its scheduled run, a search party from Munich discovered a town as empty as a discarded shell. Captain Wilhelm Hoffmann, a Prussian military officer assigned to investigate potential political implications, had documented his findings with Germanic precision. Every house had been examined, every cellar searched, every possible hiding place explored. His men had found meals half-eaten, letters half-written, children's toys scattered about as if their owners had simply paused in their play and never returned. The most unsettling discovery, Hoffman had reported to his superiors, was in the church. The entire congregation appears to have been present for evening vespers. Prayer books lay open, candles still burning low. The priest's Bible remained open to Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die. We found him neither born nor dead, but simply absent. The mystery had deepened with each subsequent disappearance. Towns in Wales, small cities in northern France, villages in the German countryside, all following the same inexplicable pattern. Local authorities, overwhelmed and terrified, had begun to reach out to national governments. The French Academy of Sciences had dispatched teams of investigators. The Royal Society in London had formed a special committee. The German Confederation had quietly assigned military intelligence officers to monitor the situation. None had found answers. All had documented the same maddening consistency: complete disappearance without explanation. Blackwood's investigation had taken on a personal dimension when his own brother, Thomas, had been in one of the affected areas. Thomas Blackwood, a young engineer working on railway expansion in the German states, had been visiting the town of Grunwald to assess potential routes for new track construction. His last letter, dated March 12, 1850, had been cheerful and routine. The locals are most accommodating, and the surveying work proceeds ahead of schedule. I expect to complete the preliminary assessments within the fortnight. When Thomas failed to return to his lodgings in Munich, Edmund had received word from the Bavarian authorities. Grunwald had become the 13th town to experience the phenomenon. Thomas Blackwood was among its 1,847 missing residents. The personal stake had driven Edmund to approach the mystery with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had traveled from town to empty town, documenting every detail, searching for any pattern that might yield understanding. His journals had grown thick with observations, measurements, sketches, and increasingly desperate theories. Standing now in Ashford's abandoned market square, Edmund recalled the conversation that had brought him here. He had been in London, presenting his preliminary findings to the Royal Geographic Society, when Lord Pemberton had mentioned the most recent disappearance. "Ashford is different," Pemberton had said, his weathered face grave with concern. "It's the largest town yet affected. Nearly 13,000 souls. But, more importantly, it's the first where we have witnesses." The witnesses were a family named Morrison who lived on a farm approximately 2 miles outside Ashford's municipal boundaries. James Morrison, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children had maintained their weekly routine of traveling into town for market day on the morning of September 8, 1851. They had found emptiness where bustling commerce should have been. Edmund had interviewed the Morrisons extensively. Their account had been consistent and disturbing. James Morrison, a man whose honesty was vouched for by every neighbor within 20 miles, had described entering Ashford at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning to find the streets completely deserted. Not quiet, mind you, Morrison had explained, his work-hardened hands fidgeting with his cap. Quiet would have been normal for that early. This was hollow, like the difference between a house where folks are sleeping and a house where no one's ever lived. Margaret Morrison had provided the most chilling detail. The bakery still had bread cooling on the racks, she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hot bread, Professor. Steam still rising from the loaves." As if Mrs. Henderson had just pulled them from the oven and stepped away for a moment. But she never came back. The Morrison family had searched for hours before finally returning to their farm and sending word to the authorities in the county seat. By the time official investigators arrived, Ashford had been empty for exactly 24 hours. Edmund walked slowly through the town's residential district, his trained eye cataloging details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. In house after house, the evidence suggested lives interrupted mid-motion rather than lives concluded or abandoned. Teacups sat half-empty on kitchen tables. Sewing remained in baskets with needles still threaded. Children's slate boards showed arithmetic problems worked halfway. to completion. He paused at the entrance to the Anglican church, a modest stone building that served as the spiritual center of the community. The heavy oak doors stood open, and Edmund stepped inside to find a scene that made his breath catch in his throat. The sanctuary showed clear evidence that Sunday service had been in progress when the disappearance occurred. Hymn books lay open to amazing grace, the pages fluttering slightly in the draft from the open doors. The pulpit Bible remained open to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. More unsettling still was the evidence of interrupted communion. Silver chalices sat on the altar, still containing wine that had begun to turn. Communion wafers remained arranged on their ceremonial plates. The Reverend Jonathan Whitmore, according to parish records, had been conducting the service for approximately 150 congregants. Edmund's scientific training had taught him to seek rational explanations, but 6 weeks of investigation had yielded nothing that satisfied reason. He had consulted with geologists about potential underground phenomena, perhaps massive sinkholes that might have swallowed entire populations. The earth showed no disturbance. He had investigated the possibility of poisonous gases from industrial processes, but medical examination of the abandoned areas revealed no toxic substances. He had even entertained theories about mass hypnosis or collective hysteria, but such explanations failed to account for the complete absence of bodies or the undisturbed state of personal property. The industrial district of Ashford provided additional mysteries. The cotton mill stood empty but operational, steam engines still warm, though no longer actively fired. Massive looms sat with half-completed cloth still threaded through their mechanisms. The mill owner's office contained ledgers with entries dated through the morning of September 7th, showing normal production quotas and worker attendance. Edmund examined the workers' quarters with particular care. These cramped but functional buildings housed the families who operated the mills, men, women, and children whose entire existence revolve around the rhythms of industrial production. In room after room, he found evidence of lives suddenly halted, where clothes laid out for the next day, meals prepared but uneaten, love letters begun but never finished. One particular discovery in the workers' quarters had stopped Edmund cold. In a small room occupied by the Walsh family, Michael, a mill foreman, his wife Catherine, and their 2 young daughters, he had found a child's diary. 7-year-old Mary Walsh had been practicing her letters, and her final entry, dated September 7th, read in careful, childish script. Mama says tomorrow we shall see something wonderful. Papa knows but won't tell. I hope it is not scary. The implications of that entry had haunted Edmund for days. It suggested foreknowledge, preparation, perhaps even anticipation. But preparation for what? And by whom? His investigation had led him to examine similar suggestive evidence in other affected towns. In St. Mere, the local priest had apparently changed his planned sermon topic the day before the disappearance, choosing instead to speak on the theme of divine translation, the biblical concept of being taken up without experiencing death, as happened to Enoch and Elijah. In Waldenburg, the town's clockmaker had stopped all the public timepieces at exactly 11:47 the evening before the disappearance, though no explanation for this action could be found. These tantalizing hints of advanced knowledge had led Edmund to develop his most disturbing theory, that the disappearances might not have been involuntary. Perhaps entire populations had somehow known what was coming and had participated in their own vanishing. The theory seemed impossible, even mad, but it was the only hypothesis that accounted for the complete absence of struggle or resistance. It also explained the careful preservation of property and the peaceful nature of the scenes left behind. But it raised questions that were perhaps even more terrifying than the original mystery. What could compel thousands of people to willingly disappear? Who or what had the power to orchestrate such events? And why? Edmund's investigation had taken an even darker turn when he discovered evidence of coordination between the affected areas. In Ashford's post office, he had found correspondence with municipal officials in 3 other towns that would later experience disappearances. The letters, dated months before those towns' respective vanishings, discussed arrangements for the autumn's scheduling and ensuring all necessary preparations are completed according to the timetable. The implications were staggering. Rather than random occurrences, the disappearances appear to be planned events involving coordination between multiple communities. But planned by whom? And for what purpose? His investigation of postal records revealed an extensive network of correspondence between the affected towns dating back nearly 2 years before the first disappearance. Letters written in a simple cipher that Edmund had eventually decoded spoke of gathering preparations, the appointed time, and fulfillment of the covenant. Most disturbing was a repeated phrase that appeared in dozens of communications. When the veil grows thin, the faithful shall pass through. Religious overtones permeated much of the correspondence, but Edmund found no evidence that any established church or sect was involved. Instead, the letters suggested the emergence of a new belief system, one that promised translation to the higher realm for those who proved worthy through proper preparation and absolute faith. The scale of organization required for such an undertaking defied comprehension. 17 towns across 3 countries, involving nearly 50,000 people, all somehow convinced to participate in their own disappearance. The logistics alone would have required years of planning and a network of trusted coordinators operating in complete secrecy. Edmund's scientific mind rebelled against supernatural explanations, but the accumulated evidence seemed to point beyond the realm of normal human experience. He had documented temperature anomalies in the days preceding each disappearance, readings that showed localized warming of exactly 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit in the affected areas. He had found evidence of unusual aurora-like phenomena reported in the skies above several towns on the nights before they emptied. Most puzzling of all, his magnetic compass readings showed consistent deviation in the abandoned areas, as if some powerful force was interfering with the Earth's magnetic field. The official response to his findings had been mixed. Government authorities, already struggling to maintain public order in an era of rapid social change, had little appetite for investigations that raised more questions than they answered. The French had classified his reports and forbidden further discussion of the matter. The Germans had transferred responsibility to military intelligence and cut off civilian access to the affected areas. Even the British, normally more open to scientific inquiry, had quietly suggested that Edmund might be better served by focusing his talents on less controversial subjects. But Edmund could not abandon his investigation, not while his brother's fate remained unknown, not while the fundamental question remained unanswered. Where had the people gone? His most recent discovery had come from an unexpected source. While examining church records in Ashford, he had found a letter hidden behind a loose board in the vestry wall, written by Reverend Whitmore just hours before the disappearance. It provided the first direct insight into the mindset of someone who had vanished. "My dear Bishop," the letter read, "I write this in the full knowledge that it will never be posted, but perhaps someday it will serve as explanation for those left behind. The revelation has come at last, as promised in the ancient texts. We have been chosen, all of us, to take part in the great translation. I confess my faith has sometimes wavered, but the signs are unmistakable. The veil between worlds grows thin, and passage becomes possible for those who have prepared themselves properly. I go gladly, knowing that what awaits us is beyond the comprehension of those who remain in the material realm. Do not mourn our departure, but rejoice that we have been found worthy of this ultimate blessing. The time of gathering is at hand." The letter was signed with a symbol Edmund had never seen before: 3 interlocking circles surrounding a vertical line that seemed to pierce through all 3. He had found similar symbols carved discreetly into buildings in every affected town, always in locations that suggested they had been placed by people with authorized access: church altars, municipal buildings, mill owners' offices, and the homes of prominent citizens. This discovery had led Edmund to his most chilling realization. The disappearances were not random events affecting isolated communities, but carefully orchestrated operations involving the leadership elements of each affected town. Someone or something had been systematically recruiting municipal leaders, religious figures, and prominent citizens, gradually building networks of believers who would eventually convince entire populations to participate in their own vanishing. The methodology was brilliant in its subtlety. Rather than trying to convert everyone directly, the organizers had focused on those who held natural authority and influence. Once the trusted leaders of a community believed, convincing the general population would have been relatively straightforward, especially if the message was presented as divine revelation or spiritual advancement. Edmund had tried to trace the origins of this mysterious movement, but had found only dead ends. The earliest correspondence he could locate dated back to 1845, but it referenced the ancient covenant and teachings preserved from the time before time, suggesting that the beliefs involved claimed much older provenance. The geographical pattern of the disappearances provided another clue. When plotted on a map, the affected towns formed a rough geometric pattern that seemed to follow ancient trade routes and pilgrimage paths. Several of the locations had been sites of religious significance dating back to pre-Christian times, places where local folklore spoke of thin places where the material and spiritual worlds intersected. This connection to ancient beliefs had led Edmund to consult with Professor Marcus Whitefield, Cambridge University's foremost authority on comparative religion and folklore. Whitefield had been initially skeptical, but had grown increasingly intrigued as Edmund shared his findings. "What you're describing," Whitefield had said during their final meeting, "bears striking similarities to ancient mystery religions, particularly those that promised initiates a form of spiritual transformation or translation to a higher plane of existence. The Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, the Mithraic cults of Rome, even certain Gnostic Christian sects, all shared the belief that physical death was unnecessary for the properly prepared soul to transcend material existence." Whitefield had also pointed out disturbing parallels to more recent religious movements. The Shakers believe in the possibility of physical translation for the spiritually perfected, he had noted. Some Adventist sects teach that the faithful will be bodily assumed into heaven without experiencing death. What makes your discoveries so unsettling is the apparent success of these beliefs. If entire populations truly have been convinced to participate in some form of mass spiritual departure, he had left the sentence unfinished, but the implications were clear. If such a thing were possible, if human consciousness could indeed transcend physical limitations through faith or proper preparation, then the disappeared populations might have achieved something that redefined the very nature of human existence. Edmund had also consulted with Dr. Alexander Hartwell, a physician who specialized in nervous disorders and what was beginning to be called mental alienation. Hartwell's perspective had been more skeptical, but no less disturbing. Mass hysteria is a documented phenomenon, Hartwell had explained, but nothing on the scale you're describing. The largest recorded cases have involved perhaps a few dozen individuals at most. To suggest that thousands of people could simultaneously succumb to shared delusion, it challenges everything we understand about the human mind. Hartwell had proposed an alternative explanation that was perhaps even more troubling than mass hysteria. What if these people were subjected to some form of systematic poisoning, something that affected mental faculties gradually over time? A substance that made them highly susceptible to suggestion, that convinced them they were experiencing divine revelation when they were actually victims of a sophisticated form of murder. This possibility had led Edmund to conduct extensive testing of water supplies, food stores, and air quality in the affected areas. He had found no evidence of poisoning, but the absence of proof did not constitute proof of absence. A sufficiently sophisticated poisoner might have used substances that left no detectable traces after prolonged exposure to the elements. The investigation had consumed 8 months of Edmund's life and had fundamentally altered his understanding of human nature and possibility. Standing now in Ashford's empty streets as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, he felt no closer to a definitive answer than when he had begun. What he did know was that 17 communities had ceased to exist as functioning human societies. Nearly 50,000 people had vanished without leaving behind any physical evidence of their fate. The official response had been to classify the events as matters of national security and to discourage further investigation. The public had been told that the affected areas had been evacuated due to industrial accidents or disease outbreaks. Explanations that satisfied few, but that most were willing to accept rather than confront the inexplicable. Edmund's final day in Ashford had yielded one last discovery. In the town's small library, hidden within the pages of a medical text, he had found a detailed map showing the locations of all 17 disappeared towns, along with dates and times of their respective vanishings. Additional markings on the map indicated 13 other locations, some in Britain, others on the continent, with future dates extending into 1852. The implications were terrifying. If the map was accurate, the disappearances were not over. More towns were scheduled to vanish. More populations were being prepared for whatever fate had befallen their predecessors. Edmund had memorized the dates and locations before carefully replacing the map where he had found it. Among the marked future locations was the small Welsh village of Llanfairpwll, where Edmund's sister Elizabeth lived with her husband and children. According to the map, Llanfairpwll was scheduled for translation on November 15th, 1851, just 6 weeks away. The discovery had forced Edmund to confront an impossible choice. If he warned the authorities, they would likely dismiss his claims as the fantasies of a man driven mad by grief over his brother's disappearance. Even if they took him seriously, any official intervention might simply cause the organizers to alter their plans, making it even more difficult to understand or prevent future vanishings. But if he did nothing, his sister and her family might join the ranks of the disappeared. Edmund had no doubt that Elizabeth would never willingly participate in such a scheme, but the evidence suggested that the organizers were remarkably skilled at convincing entire populations to embrace their own vanishing. Edmund had ultimately decided on a middle course. He would travel to Llanfairpwll under the pretense of conducting geological research, arriving several weeks before the scheduled date. He would observe the community carefully, looking for signs of the preliminary activities that seemed to precede each disappearance. If he could identify the local organizers and understand their methods, perhaps he could find a way to disrupt their plans without alerting them to his knowledge. The journey to Wales had taken 3 days, and Edmund had spent the time reviewing everything he knew about the pattern of disappearances. Each event had been preceded by a period of approximately 6 months, during which local leaders gradually introduced new ideas and beliefs to their communities. The process was subtle, often disguised as philosophical discussion groups or informal theological study circles. The organizers seemed to target communities that were already experiencing social stress, places where traditional ways of life were being disrupted by industrialization, where people felt disconnected from old certainties and were open to new forms of meaning and purpose. They offered a message of hope and transcendence that spoke to deep human longings for something beyond the material struggles of daily existence. Llanfairpwll proved to fit the pattern perfectly. A village of approximately 800 residents, it had been significantly impacted by the expansion of slate quarrying operations that brought both economic opportunity and social disruption. Traditional farming families found themselves working alongside industrial laborers, creating tensions between old and new ways of life. Edmund had taken lodgings at the village's small inn and had quickly identified the signs he had learned to recognize. Dr. William Llewellyn, the local physician, had been conducting evening discussions on the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to divine purpose. Reverend Owen Davies had recently begun incorporating unusual theological concepts into his sermons, focusing on themes of spiritual preparation and the possibility of bodily assumption into higher realms. Most telling of all was the presence of Miss Cordelia Ashworth, a woman of approximately 40 years who had arrived in the village 6 months earlier, claiming to be conducting research into Welsh folklore and traditional beliefs. Edmund's investigation had revealed that women matching her description had been present in at least 5 of the previously affected towns during the months preceding their disappearances. Miss Ashworth had established herself as a respected member of the community through a combination of apparent learning, generous charitable contributions, and an almost supernatural ability to provide comfort and guidance to those facing personal difficulties. Edmund had observed her conducting private conversations with village leaders and had noted that each such conversation seemed to result in subtle changes in the recipient's behavior and attitudes. The methodology was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to convert people through dramatic revelations or emotional appeals, Miss Ashworth and her associates worked gradually, introducing new ideas through seemingly casual conversations and allowing recipients to reach their own conclusions. The process created a sense of personal discovery rather than external pressure, making the resulting beliefs feel authentic and self-generated. Edmund had documented the progression of changes in the village over the course of 3 weeks. Church attendance had increased significantly, but the focus had shifted from traditional worship to discussions of spiritual advancement and preparation for the Great Transition. Dr. Llewellyn had begun holding special clinics focused on purification of mind and body, treatments that seemed to leave patients feeling euphoric and deeply peaceful. Most disturbing was the emergence of what could only be described as collective anticipation. People went about their daily activities with a sense of expectancy, as if they were waiting for some wonderful event that had been promised but not yet revealed. Children played games that involved going to the beautiful place, and adults spoke in hushed, excited tones about the day of gathering. Edmund had tried to engage village residents in conversation about these changes, but he found that direct questions were invariably deflected with gentle smiles and vague references to personal spiritual development or preparation for divine blessing. The few residents who seemed unaffected by the general mood were elderly or infirm individuals who had limited contact with the broader community. 10 days before the scheduled disappearance date, Edmund had observed a significant escalation in activity. Miss Ashworth and several other individuals he had not previously seen began conducting house-to-house visits, spending several hours with each family. Following these visits, residents exhibited signs of profound transformation, a sense of peace and purpose so complete that it seemed almost otherworldly. Edmund had attempted to observe one of these private meetings by positioning himself near an open window, but the conversation had been conducted in voices too low for him to overhear. What he had been able to observe was the profound change in the family's demeanor following Miss Ashworth's departure. They had embraced each other with tears of joy and had spent the remainder of the evening in what appeared to be prayer or meditation. 3 days before the scheduled date, Edmund had made his most disturbing discovery. While exploring the countryside around the village, he had found a large clearing in the nearby woods where the ground had been marked with the same 3-circle symbol he had found in the other affected towns. The symbol had been created using white stones arranged in a pattern approximately 30 feet across, and the surrounding area showed evidence of regular gatherings. More unsettling still were the personal items he found arranged around the perimeter of the clearing: jewelry, watches, family photographs, and other objects of obvious sentimental value. The arrangement suggested that villagers had been coming to this place for some time, leaving behind possessions that connected them to their current existence in preparation for whatever transition was planned. Edmund had also discovered evidence of more extensive preparation. Livestock had been quietly relocated to farms in neighboring villages, with explanations that families were simplifying their earthly commitments. Several homes had been cleaned and organized with meticulous care, as if their owners were preparing for a long absence. Most tellingly, the village school had suspended classes indefinitely, with the explanation that the children needed time for spiritual preparation. 2 days before the scheduled disappearance, Edmund had witnessed an event that had shaken him to his core. The entire village population had gathered in the church for what was described as a service of thanksgiving and preparation. From his position outside the building, Edmund had heard singing of extraordinary beauty and power, voices raised in harmonies that seemed to transcend normal human capability. When the service had concluded and residents had emerged, Edmund had been struck by the transformation in their appearance. Every face reflected a peace and joy so profound that it seemed to illuminate them from within. They moved with a grace and purpose that suggested complete freedom from earthly concerns, as if they had already begun their transition to whatever realm awaited them. The final day had arrived with an atmosphere of barely contained anticipation. Edmund had observed families spending quiet time together, but there was no sadness or sense of farewell in their interactions. Instead, they seemed to be celebrating the approach of some long-awaited reunion. Children played contentedly while adults went about their daily activities with serene efficiency. As evening had approached, Edmund had positioned himself in the woods overlooking the village, determined to witness whatever was about to unfold. The sun had set with unusual brilliance, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than natural. The village below had glowed with warm light from every window, and the sound of gentle singing had drifted up through the still air. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time recorded in several other disappearances, the singing had ceased. The lights in the village windows had dimmed gradually, as if controlled by some central mechanism. And then, in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, they had gone out completely. Edmund had waited until dawn before descending to investigate the village. What he had found was exactly what he had come to expect: empty buildings, undisturbed personal possessions, and no trace of the 800 souls who had called Landfairpool home. His sister Elizabeth's house had been as empty as all the others. Her family vanished along with the rest of the population. But, unlike his previous investigations, this time Edmund had been present to witness the moment of disappearance. And what he had seen in that final half-minute had challenged every assumption he had formed about the nature of the vanishings. As the lights had dimmed, Edmund had observed what could only be described as a soft luminescence surrounding the entire village, a pale, silver-blue radiance that seemed to emanate from the buildings themselves. Within that glow, he had caught glimpses of movement, but not the kind of movement he had expected. Rather than people fleeing or being forcibly removed, the figures he could make out had seemed to be ascending, their forms becoming gradually less distinct until they merged entirely with the surrounding light. The phenomenon had lasted less than a minute, and when it had ended, the village had been as empty and still as a photograph. But Edmund had been left with the inescapable impression that he had witnessed not a tragedy, but a transformation. The peaceful expressions on the faces he had glimpsed, the graceful nature of their apparent ascension, the complete absence of fear or distress, all suggested that whatever had happened to the villagers had been not only voluntary, but welcomed. In the days following the Landfairpool disappearance, Edmund had found himself grappling with questions that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. If what he had witnessed was genuine, if entire populations were somehow transcending physical existence through faith or preparation, then the scientific materialism that had guided his career was inadequate to explain the full spectrum of human possibility. The alternative explanations seemed equally troubling. If the disappearances were the result of some advanced technology or sophisticated manipulation, then someone or something possessed capabilities far beyond current human knowledge. The precision required to coordinate such events across multiple countries, the ability to convince thousands of rational people to participate in their own vanishing, the power to make physical matter disappear without trace, all pointed to resources and understanding that surpassed anything in Edmund's experience. His investigation had concluded with more questions than answers, but it had also provided him with a profound shift in perspective. Whether the disappeared populations had achieved some form of spiritual transcendence or had fallen victim to an incredibly sophisticated form of manipulation, their fate demonstrated that human existence was far more mysterious and malleable than conventional science acknowledged. The official response to Edmund's final report had been swift and decisive. The Royal Geographic Society had thanked him for his service and had classified his findings indefinitely. Government authorities had quietly but firmly suggested that his future research focus on less controversial subjects. The affected areas had been declared unsafe for civilian access and had been turned over to military administration. But the map Edmund had found in Ashford's library had proven accurate. 3 more towns had disappeared according to the predicted schedule, and reports of similar phenomena had begun to emerge from other parts of Europe and even from the American frontier. Whatever force or organization was responsible for the vanishings, it continued to operate with apparent impunity. The mystery of the 19th century empty cities remained unsolved, but Edmund's investigation had revealed the outline of something vast and unprecedented in human history. Whether it represented the emergence of new spiritual possibilities or the execution of the most ambitious and terrifying conspiracy ever conceived, it had demonstrated that the boundaries between the possible and impossible were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. In his private journal, Edmund had written his final thoughts on the matter. "I've spent nearly a year investigating the disappearance of nearly 50,000 human souls, and I am forced to conclude that I understand less about the nature of human existence now than when I began. What I have witnessed suggests either that consciousness can transcend physical limitations in ways that science cannot yet comprehend, or that forces beyond our current understanding are reshaping the very fabric of human society. In either case, the world we thought we knew has proven to be far stranger and more malleable than we ever suspected." The empty cities stood as monuments to this fundamental mystery. Buildings remained, but souls had vanished, leaving behind only questions that challenged every assumption about the nature of human existence. The terrible mystery was not just what had happened to the disappeared populations, but what their fate revealed about the limitations of human knowledge and the vast realms of possibility that lay beyond conventional understanding. And somewhere in the civilized world, Miss Cordelia Ashworth and her associates continued their work, preparing new communities for whatever transformation awaited those deemed ready for the Great Transition. The age of empty cities was not over, and the mystery that had begun in St. Meervert continued to unfold across a world that was proving to be far stranger than anyone had dared to imagine. Edmund's investigation might have ended there, relegated to classified files and official silence, but fate had one more revelation in store. 3 months after the Landfair Pool disappearance, he received an unexpected visitor at his London residence. Dr. Helena Vasquez had traveled from Madrid with a story that would shatter Edmund's remaining assumptions about the scope and nature of the phenomenon. A professor of ancient languages at the Universidad Complutense, Dr. Vasquez had been conducting research into medieval manuscripts when she had stumbled upon references to similar disappearances dating back centuries. "Professor Blackwood," she had said, her English careful but precise, "what you have documented is not a new phenomenon, but the latest manifestation of something that has been occurring for over 1,000 years." Dr. Vasquez had brought with her photocopies of manuscripts from monastery libraries across Spain, France, and Italy. Written in Latin, Greek, and various vernacular languages, these documents described events that followed the same pattern Edmund had observed in the 19th century disappearances. Entire communities vanishing overnight, leaving behind only empty buildings and bewildered neighbors. The earliest account dated to 847 AD, describing the disappearance of a monastery in the Pyrenees. The chronicler, a monk named Brother Bartholomew from a neighboring abbey, had written, "The brothers of St. Cyprian were gathered for matins when the light of heaven descended upon their house. By dawn, the monastery stood empty, though their voices could still be heard singing the Gloria in excelsis for 3 days thereafter, growing ever fainter until silence claimed the sacred place. Medieval chronicles from across Europe contained similar accounts. Villages that vanished during the Black Death, leaving behind populations that had somehow escaped both plague and earthly existence. Entire congregations that disappeared during religious festivals, their empty churches found with altars still warm from divine presence. Monastic communities that achieved such spiritual perfection that they transcended physical existence entirely. The church recorded these events, Dr. Vasquez explained, but interpreted them as miracles rather than mysteries. Communities that achieved such holiness that God called them directly to paradise, bypassing death entirely. But the pattern you have documented suggests something far more systematic. The medieval accounts contain details that paralleled Edmund's findings with disturbing accuracy. Mysterious visitors who arrived months before the disappearances, bearing messages of spiritual preparation. Leaders who gradually changed their teachings to focus on themes of transcendence and translation. Symbols carved into sacred spaces, variations of the 3 interlocking circles that Edmund had found in the 19th century sites. Most significantly, several medieval chroniclers had noted that the disappeared communities had been visited by Magistra Cordelia, a woman of uncertain age who traveled widely, bringing messages of divine revelation and spiritual advancement. The name was too similar to Cordelia Ashworth to be coincidental. Dr. Vasquez had traced references to this figure across 7 centuries of manuscripts, always described as a woman of middle years, always bearing the same name, always associated with communities that subsequently vanished. The descriptions of her appearance remained remarkably consistent across time periods and geographical locations, as if the same individual had been present at events separated by hundreds of years and thousands of miles. Either, Dr. Vasquez had concluded, we are dealing with a title or position passed down through generations of organizers, or we are confronting something that transcends normal human limitations of lifespan and mortality. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Vasquez's research was accurate, the 19th century disappearances were not isolated events, but part of a pattern stretching back over a millennium. Someone or something had been systematically identifying and translating human communities for 1,000 years, operating with such consistency and success that the phenomenon had been absorbed into religious mythology as divine miracle rather than recognized as systematic intervention. Edmund had spent weeks studying the medieval manuscripts, comparing them with his own observations and findings. The parallels were undeniable. The same methodology, the same symbols, the same careful preparation of entire populations, and the same complete disappearance without physical trace. The technology might have been different. Medieval communities lacked the industrial infrastructure of 19th century towns, but the essential pattern remained unchanged. Dr. Vasquez had also brought disturbing news from contemporary sources. Her contacts in the Spanish academic community had reported recent disappearances that followed the familiar pattern. 3 small villages in the Andalusian mountains had been found empty within the past year. Their populations vanished as completely as their medieval and 19th century predecessors. The phenomenon is not historical, she had emphasized. It continues in our present day, and if the pattern holds, it will continue into the future. This revelation had prompted Edmund to reach out to colleagues across Europe and beyond, seeking reports of similar contemporary events. What he discovered was evidence of a global phenomenon that had been hidden by geographical isolation and official suppression. Professor Johann Kellermann of the University of Vienna reported the disappearance of 2 alpine villages in 1852. Father Giuseppe Martinelli, a Jesuit scholar in Rome, provided documentation of 3 Italian communities that had vanished between 1850 and 1853. Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a Russian ethnographer, described similar events in remote Siberian settlements. where entire populations of indigenous peoples had disappeared, leaving behind only empty yurts and traditional dwellings. Most shocking of all was a letter from Dr. James Whitmore, a missionary working in the American Southwest. Dr. Whitmore described the disappearance of several Pueblo Indian communities, events that local tribes attributed to the return of the ancestors, but which followed the same pattern Edmund had documented in Europe. The geographical scope was breathtaking. From the Arctic settlements of northern Canada to the desert communities of Australia, from isolated islands in the Pacific to mountain villages in the Himalayas, reports emerged of populations that had simply vanished. The phenomenon was not limited to Christian communities or European civilization. It appeared to affect human settlements across all cultures, religions, and levels of technological development. Edmund began to see the 19th century European disappearances not as unique events, but as part of a vast, coordinated operation that spanned continents and cultures. The organizers, whoever or whatever they were, had been systematically identifying communities that met certain criteria and facilitating their transition to somewhere else. The question of destination had become paramount in Edmund's thinking. Where were the disappeared populations going? The medieval manuscript spoke of translation to paradise, but that explanation satisfied neither scientific inquiry nor the evidence of systematic organization. If tens of thousands of people were being relocated rather than eliminated, there had to be a destination, a place where they continued to exist in some form. Dr. Vasquez had discovered tantalizing clues in her research. Several medieval texts referenced the hidden realm or the sanctuary beyond the veil, described as a place where the translated communities continued their existence under different conditions. These references suggested not death or dissolution, but relocation to a parallel reality where physical laws operated differently. The ancients understood something we have forgotten, Dr. Vasquez had explained. They believed that reality consisted of multiple layers or dimensions, and that certain individuals or communities could transition between them under proper conditions. What we call disappearance, they might have understood as successful navigation between worlds. This concept of parallel realities had led Edmund to investigate contemporary scientific theories about the nature of space and time. Recent mathematical work by scholars like Bernhard Riemann had begun to suggest that three-dimensional space might not represent the totality of reality. If additional dimensions existed beyond human perception, it was theoretically possible that matter could transition between different dimensional states. The idea seemed fantastic, but it provided a framework for understanding how entire populations could vanish without leaving physical traces. If the organizers possessed technology or knowledge that allowed manipulation of dimensional boundaries, they could facilitate the translation of matter from one reality to another. Edmund's investigation had also uncovered evidence of the enormous resources required for such an operation. Financial records from several disappeared towns showed significant monetary transfers in the months preceding their vanishing. Gold and silver had been quietly accumulated and then disappeared along with the populations. Valuable artworks and historical artifacts had been removed from museums and private collections across Europe, always just before their host communities experienced the phenomenon. The pattern suggested that the organizers were not only relocating people, but were systematically transferring cultural and material wealth to whatever destination awaited the disappeared populations. This implied long-term planning and permanent establishment rather than temporary relocation or destruction. Perhaps most disturbing was Edmund's discovery that the phenomenon was accelerating. Medieval chronicles described disappearances occurring perhaps once or twice per century. The 19th century events had compressed this timeline to multiple disappearances per year. Contemporary reports suggested an even faster pace, with new vanishings occurring almost monthly across different parts of the world. The acceleration implied urgency, as if the organizers were working towards some sort of deadline or quota. Edmund's analysis of the temporal patterns suggested that the rate of disappearances was doubling approximately every 50 years, following a mathematical progression that would reach truly staggering numbers by the end of the 19th century. If the trend continued, hundreds of communities could be affected annually by 1900. The demographic impact would become impossible to conceal, and the very fabric of human civilization could be fundamentally altered by the systematic removal of entire populations. This realization had led Edmund to a terrifying conclusion. The disappearances were not random events or even systematic harvesting, but preparation for something larger. The organizers appeared to be building toward a climactic event that would require vast numbers of people and enormous resources. The disappeared populations were not victims, but participants in some grand design whose ultimate purpose remained hidden. Edmund's research had also revealed disturbing changes in the methodology of recent disappearances. While earlier events had required months of careful preparation, more recent vanishings showed signs of improved efficiency. Populations were being prepared and translated in ever shorter time frames, suggesting that the organizers had refined their techniques through centuries of practice. The implications for potential resistance were sobering. If communities could be prepared for translation in a matter of weeks rather than months, conventional authorities would have little time to identify and intervene in the process. The organizers had achieved a level of operational sophistication that made detection and prevention increasingly difficult. Even more troubling was evidence that the organizers were adapting their methods to accommodate different cultural and technological contexts. While European communities had been approached through religious frameworks emphasizing spiritual transcendence, reports from other parts of the world suggested different approaches tailored to local beliefs and customs. Native American communities had been told that the ancestors were calling them home to the spirit world. African villages had received messages about returning to the original homeland beyond the Great Waters. Asian settlements had been prepared through concepts of enlightenment and escape from the cycle of earthly rebirth. The organizers demonstrated remarkable cultural sophistication, able to present their message in terms that resonated with virtually any human belief system. This adaptability suggested an intelligence that transcended human limitations of cultural knowledge and linguistic capability. The coordination required to simultaneously operate across dozens of cultures and languages, each with distinct worldviews and spiritual frameworks, implied resources and understanding far beyond what any human organization could achieve. Edmund had begun to consider the possibility that the organizers were not human at all, or at least not entirely human. The consistency of appearance across centuries, the sophisticated understanding of diverse cultures, the apparent technological capabilities that allowed dimensional manipulation, all pointed toward entities whose nature and origins lay beyond conventional human experience. The medieval manuscripts Dr. Vasquez had discovered contained scattered references to the appearance of the organizers that supported this hypothesis. While generally described as human in form, chroniclers consistently noted subtle anomalies. Eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals, voices that carried harmonics beyond normal human range, an agelessness that seemed to transcend natural aging processes. They walk among us, but are not of us, one 13th century monk had written. Beautiful as angels, but strange as visitors from distant stars. They bring messages of transformation that touch the deepest longings of the human soul. The description resonated with Edmund's own brief encounter with Miss Cordelia Ashworth. During his investigation in Landfair Pool, he had observed her from a distance and had noted something indefinably alien about her presence. She had moved with a grace that seemed to defy normal human limitations, and her voice, when he had overheard it, had carried a quality that made his skin crawl while simultaneously filling him with inexplicable longing. These observations had led Edmund to develop his most radical theory, that humanity was not alone on Earth, and that the disappeared populations were being systematically removed by non-human entities for purposes that remained hidden. The thousand-year pattern suggested a long-term project of enormous scope, possibly involving the gradual relocation of selected human populations to serve some function in a larger design. The theory seemed to border on madness, but Edmund could find no alternative explanation that accounted for all the evidence. The consistency across time and culture, the technological sophistication, the apparent immortality or extreme longevity of key organizers, the systematic nature of the operation, all pointed toward intervention by entities whose capabilities exceeded human limitations. This conclusion had prompted Edmund to examine historical accounts of other anomalous phenomena that might be connected to the disappearances. He discovered disturbing parallels in reports of supernatural encounters, unexplained aerial phenomena, and accounts of contact with beings of non-human intelligence. Medieval chronicles contain numerous descriptions of sky ships and celestial carriages that appeared in the vicinity of communities shortly before they disappeared. Renaissance artists had depicted strange aerial objects in religious paintings, often associated with scenes of divine ascension or translation. Even contemporary reports from reliable witnesses described unusual lights and aerial phenomena observed over the disappeared towns in the nights preceding their vanishing. The pattern suggested that the organizers possessed transportation technology far in advance of human capability. This would explain their ability to coordinate operations across vast geographical distances and to remove entire populations without leaving traces of conventional travel or relocation. Edmund had also discovered references to underground installations in several of the affected areas. Medieval mining records describe the discovery of artificial caverns and structures beneath some of the disappeared communities, installations that predated human settlement and appeared to be constructed using unknown techniques and materials. Archaeological investigation of these sites have been limited by official restrictions and the remote locations of many disappeared towns, but the available evidence suggested extensive subterranean networks that might serve as staging areas for the translation operations. If the organizers had been establishing underground facilities for centuries, they would possess the infrastructure necessary to prepare and process large populations for whatever destination awaited them. The underground installations also provided a potential explanation for how entire populations could vanish without witnesses, rather than ascending into the sky or simply dissolving into light. The disappeared communities might have been directed into subterranean facilities where they underwent whatever process facilitated their translation to the hidden realm. This possibility had led Edmund to investigate geological anomalies in the areas surrounding disappeared towns. His analysis revealed consistent patterns of unusual magnetic fields, temperature variations, and seismic activity that suggested large-scale underground operations. The geological evidence supported the hypothesis that significant construction and activity were occurring beneath the surface in all the affected areas. The scope of the underground network implied centuries of preparation and enormous resources devoted to the project. If tunnels and facilities connected all the disappeared communities, the organizers had created a hidden infrastructure that spanned continents and represented one of the largest construction projects in human history, despite remaining completely concealed from surface observation. Edmund's investigation had also uncovered financial evidence of the resources being directed toward the disappearance project. Banking records from London, Paris, and other major financial centers showed enormous transfers of gold and currency to accounts controlled by individuals using names that appeared in connection with the disappeared communities. The amounts involved were staggering, enough to finance major military campaigns or the construction of entire cities. The money was being systematically extracted from human economic systems and redirected toward whatever infrastructure supported the translation operations. The financial drain was subtle but significant, representing a hidden tax on human civilization that funded its own systematic dismantling. Most disturbing was evidence that the financial manipulation extended to the highest levels of European government and commerce. Several prominent banking families had members who seemed to be coordinating with the organizers, facilitating the transfer of resources while maintaining plausible deniability about the ultimate destination of the funds. The involvement of established financial institutions suggested that the organizers had either infiltrated human power structures or had convinced key individuals to cooperate with their agenda. Either possibility implied that the disappearance project had support within the very systems that should have been detecting and preventing it. Edmund had attempted to trace the ultimate recipients of the transferred funds, but the money seemed to vanish into a network of shell companies and false identities that defied investigation. The financial trail led repeatedly to dead ends, as if the organizers possessed techniques for moving money that left no traceable records. The systematic financial manipulation reinforced Edmund's conclusion that the disappearance project was far larger and more sophisticated than any human organization could achieve. The coordination required to simultaneously extract resources from multiple national economies while maintaining operational security suggested capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. As Edmund's investigation had progressed, he had become increasingly aware that he was being watched. Subtle signs, letters that had been opened and resealed, hotel rooms that had been searched in his absence, strangers who appeared repeatedly in different cities during his travels, suggested that his activities had attracted attention from those who preferred that the mystery remain unsolved. The surveillance was sophisticated but not hostile, at least not initially. Edmund had the impression that he was being observed and evaluated rather than threatened. This suggested that the organizers were aware of his investigation, but had not yet decided whether he represented a threat to their operations. The realization that he was under observation had forced Edmund to develop increasingly elaborate precautions. He had begun using codes in his correspondence, maintaining multiple sets of false identities, and storing his research materials in various hidden locations to prevent their confiscation or destruction. Despite these precautions, Edmund had discovered that several of his hidden research caches had been discovered and their contents examined. Notably, nothing had been removed or destroyed, but the materials had been carefully studied and then replaced exactly as they had been found. The message was clear. The organizers wanted him to know that his activities were being monitored and that his security measures were inadequate to prevent their access. The psychological pressure of constant observation had begun to affect Edmund's mental state. He found himself questioning whether his investigation was serving any useful purpose or was simply providing intelligence to those he sought to expose. The possibility that his research was actually assisting the organizers by helping them identify weaknesses in their operational security had become a source of profound anxiety. Nevertheless, Edmund had persisted with his investigation, driven by the conviction that the truth needed to be documented even if it could not be immediately acted upon. His brother Thomas and sister Elizabeth remained among the disappeared, and he owed it to their memory to understand what had happened to them. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn when Edmund received a cryptic message delivered to his London address by an unknown courier. The message, written in the same cipher he had encountered in postal communications between disappeared towns, read, "Your dedication has been noted. An opportunity for understanding awaits those who seek truth above safety." The Sanctuary of St. Bartholomew. Midnight on the Feast of All Souls. The message had presented Edmund with an impossible choice. The reference to St. Bartholomew could only refer to the ancient priory ruins located in the Yorkshire countryside, a site that his research had connected to one of the earliest recorded disappearances in medieval England. The Feast of All Souls fell on November 2nd, just 5 days after he had received the message. The invitation was clearly a trap, or at minimum a test whose outcomes he could not predict. But it also represented his first direct contact with the organizers and possibly his only chance to obtain answers to the questions that had consumed 3 years of his life. After careful consideration, Edmund had decided to accept the invitation. He had made arrangements for his research materials to be delivered to specific colleagues in the event of his disappearance, had written detailed letters explaining his investigation to be published if he failed to return, and had traveled to Yorkshire with the grimly realistic expectation that he might not survive the encounter. The ruins of St. Bartholomew Priory stood on a windswept moor, their broken stone walls barely visible against the starlit sky. Edmund had arrived an hour before midnight, and had concealed himself among the fallen masonry to observe whoever might appear for the appointed meeting. At precisely midnight, figures had begun to emerge from the shadows, not walking from the surrounding countryside as Edmund had expected, but seeming to materialize from the very air itself. He counted 12 individuals, all wearing hooded robes that concealed their features, arranged in a circle among the ruins. One figure, standing apart from the others, had removed her hood to reveal the ageless features of Cordelia Ashworth. Even in the dim starlight, her face had seemed to glow with an inner radiance that transcended normal human appearance. "Professor Blackwood," she had spoken, her voice carrying clearly across the ruins despite the distance. "You may come forward. Your questions deserve answers, and the time has come for you to understand what you have spent so long investigating." Edmund had emerged from his hiding place, acutely aware that he was completely at the mercy of beings whose capabilities he had only begun to comprehend. As he had approached the circle of figures, he had noted that they cast no shadows despite the bright moonlight, and that the ground beneath their feet showed a faint luminescence similar to what he had observed during the Landfair Pool disappearance. "You have documented our work with remarkable accuracy," Miss Ashworth had continued as Edmund drew near. "Your understanding of our methodology surpasses that of any previous investigator. This dedication to truth, despite considerable personal cost, has earned our respect and this opportunity for enlightenment." Edmund had found his voice despite the surreal nature of the situation. "What are you? Where do the disappeared people go? What is the purpose of your 1,000-year project?" Miss Ashworth had smiled, an expression that combined genuine warmth with infinite sadness. "We are what your people once were, and what they may become again. The disappeared populations have not been destroyed or enslaved, but translated to a reality where consciousness is not bound by the limitations of physical matter. We are preparing humanity for a transition that will determine the survival of your species." The explanation had raised more questions than it answered, but before Edmund could respond, Miss Ashworth had gestured toward the other hooded figures. "These are representatives of the communities you have investigated. They volunteered to return briefly to help you understand that what appears to be tragedy is actually salvation." The figures had lowered their hoods one by one, revealing faces that Edmund recognized from his investigations. Thomas, his missing brother, stood among them, his appearance unchanged except for an aura of peace and purpose that transformed his familiar features. Elizabeth, his vanished sister, smiled at him with an expression of joy that transcended any happiness he had seen in her during life. "The physical realm is ending," Thomas had spoken, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated beyond normal human hearing. "Not through catastrophe, but through evolution. Those who are ready may transition to a reality where consciousness determines existence rather than being enslaved by material limitations. Those who remain will face extinction when the current phase of reality concludes." Elizabeth had added her voice to the explanation. "We came willingly because we understood that clinging to dying forms prevents growth into higher possibilities. The children you saw playing in our village were preparing for transformation, not disappearance. What seems like death to those who remain below is birth into fuller existence for those who ascend." The revelation had shattered Edmund's assumptions about the nature of the disappearances. Rather than victims of some vast conspiracy, the translated populations had been willing participants in a form of evolution that transcended physical existence. The organizers were not aliens or supernatural entities, but evolved humans who had already undergone the transition they were offering to others. Miss Ashworth had continued the explanation. The process requires careful preparation because consciousness must be gradually freed from its attachment to material limitation. Those who attempt transition without proper readiness face dissolution rather than translation. Our work spans centuries because evolution cannot be rushed without destroying those it seeks to elevate. Edmund had struggled to comprehend the implications. But the empty cities, the abandonment of civilization. Surely this represents the destruction of everything humanity has built. Humanity has built prisons of matter and circumstance, Thomas had replied. The cities will remain for those who need them, but they will not contain those who have learned to exist as pure consciousness. The next phase of human development requires abandoning the illusion that physical reality represents the limits of possibility. The conversation had continued through the night, with the translated beings patiently answering Edmund's questions and gradually revealing the scope and purpose of their project. The disappearances were preparation for a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself, a transition that would either elevate humanity to a higher form of existence or leave those who remained behind to face extinction as the current phase of universal development concluded. The process was voluntary, but irreversible. Those who chose translation would retain their individual consciousness while gaining access to capabilities and perspectives impossible within physical limitation. Those who remained in material existence would continue their current form of life until the transition period ended, at which point the physical universe would begin a decline that would eventually eliminate all matter-based consciousness. The choice is not between life and death, Elizabeth had explained, but between evolution and stagnation. We offer transformation to those who are ready, and time for preparation to those who are not yet able to transcend physical attachment. As dawn had approached, Edmund had been faced with the ultimate decision. The translated beings had offered him the opportunity to undergo immediate transition, joining his brother and sister in the higher realm of consciousness-based existence. Alternatively, he could return to the physical world with knowledge of what was occurring and assist in preparing others for the choice that would eventually face all humanity. The decision had required Edmund to confront everything he believed about the nature of existence, consciousness, and reality itself. The evidence of his own senses confirmed that the beings he spoke with were genuinely his transformed relatives, possessing memories and characteristics that proved their identity while demonstrating capabilities that transcended physical limitation. After hours of consideration, Edmund had chosen to return to the physical world as an agent of preparation rather than immediately joining the translated realm. His scientific training and investigative experience would be valuable in helping others understand the choice they would face, and he felt obligated to use his knowledge to assist humanity's transition rather than abandoning those who remain behind. The decision had been accepted with understanding by the translated beings. Miss Ashworth had provided Edmund with additional information about the timeline and scope of the transition process, knowledge that would guide his future work in preparing other communities for the choice between evolution and extinction. The translation project would continue for approximately another century, during which time the rate of disappearances would accelerate as more communities achieved readiness for transition. Those who chose to remain in physical existence would have that century to prepare either for their own eventual translation or for the challenges of continued material existence after the transition period ended. Edmund had been warned that his new role would be dangerous. Knowledge of the translation project was restricted because premature revelation could cause panic and resistance that would interfere with the careful preparation required for successful transition. He would need to work subtly, identifying individuals and communities that showed readiness for advanced understanding while avoiding the attention of authorities who would see the translation project as a threat to established order. As the sun had risen over the Yorkshire moors, Edmund had found himself alone among the ancient ruins, the translated beings having returned to their realm of consciousness-based existence. The experience might have seemed like an elaborate dream except for the detailed information they had provided about future disappearance sites and the timeline for humanity's ultimate choice between evolution and extinction. Returning to London, Edmund had begun the next phase of his work, no longer investigating mysterious disappearances, but secretly facilitating humanity's preparation for the greatest transition in the history of consciousness itself.